5. Prayer as friendship with God. Perhaps many of us find that the growth of prayer is also associated with the cultivation of friendships. It is as if the relational quality of life that is nurtured and cultivated in personal friendships on the horizontal level of companionship assists us also to deepen friendship with God in prayer on the vertical level. This, then, is another trait of Lewis. He grew in prayer as he grew into friendships. Sometimes they were boon companionships, at other times they sprung from correspondence with strangers who became real friends, like the American lady. Perhaps, too, as Lewis leaned on confidants in his distresses, so he should reach out to others in their needs too. Forgiveness, he once said, is another name for being forgiven. This reciprocity explains perhaps the largesse he gave to others in his enormous correspondence, indicative of what he felt he received from his trust in God. So, at the outbreak of the war in 1939, he wrote to his old pupil and friend Bede Griffiths, "I was terrified to find how fearful I was by the crisis. Pray for me for courage." Again he writes to him in 1954, "I had prayed hard for a couple of nights before, that my faith might be strengthened. The response was immediate, and your book gave the finishing touch." That is, The Golden String, Griffith's autobiography. Again, on December the 20th, 1961, Lewis wrote to Griffiths after his wife's death, "I prayed when I buried my wife, my whole sexual nature should be buried with her, and it seems it has happened. Thus one recurrent trial has vanished from my life, an enormous liberty. Of course, this may be old age." Another special friend was Sister Penelope Lawson. His first letter to her he wrote in 1939, saying, "Though I'm 40 years old, I'm only about 12 as a Christian, so it would be a maternal act if you found time sometimes to mention me in your prayers." Then on October 24th, 1940, he told her, "I'm going to make my first confession next week, which will seem an odd experience. The decision to do so was one of the hardest I have ever made, but now that I'm committed, by dint of posting the letter before I had time to change my mind, I began to be afraid of the opposite extreme, afraid that I was merely indulging in an orgy of egoism." A month later, he wrote again to say, "Well, we have come through the wall of fire and find ourselves, somewhat to our surprise, still alive and even well." The story about an orgy of egoism turns out, like all the enemy propaganda, to have just a grain of truth in it. But I have no doubt that the proper method of dealing with that is to continue the practice, as I intend to do. For after all, everything, even virtue, even prayer, has its dangers, and if one heeds the grain of truth in the enemy propaganda, one can never do anything at all. A particular thorn in the flesh for Lewis was Mrs. Moore, who was the mother of a friend killed in the First World War and with whom Lewis had had an unfortunate romance that turned sour. She continued to live with Lewis and his brother for many years, and her last years in the household got progressively worse. During one particular crisis over her, Lewis wrote to Sister Penelope, "It was a bad time, but I almost venture to say I felt Christ in the house as I had never done before." Signing himself Brother Ass, he added contritely, "But alas, such a house for him to visit." Years before, his brother had wistfully compared their own troubled household with that of the Dysons, where life seemed one long series of delightful picnics. So again Lewis wrote to Sister Penelope on January the 3rd, 1945, "Pray for me. I am suffering incessant temptations to uncharitable thoughts at present, one of those black moods in which nearly all one's friends seem to be selfish or even false. And how terrible that there should be even a kind of pleasure in thinking evil. As Mrs. Moore sunk into senility and kept the household in constant discord, he wrote, "I have been feeling that very much lately, that cheerful insecurity is what our Lord asks of us." Again, on June the 5th, 1951, Lewis wrote to her, "I especially need your prayers because I am, like the pilgrim in Bunyan, travelling across a plain called ease. Everything without and many things within are marvellously well at present." It was at this time that he began to think of writing a book on prayer. Perhaps it began to dawn upon him that he could not do this without more experience of its reality in his own life. For on February the 15th, 1954, Lewis wrote again to Sister Penelope, "I have had to abandon the book on prayer. It was clearly not for me." He kept this postponement for the next 9 years of his life, indeed to the year he died. But while he was writing it, his wife, Joy Davidman, commented how excited she was about his project, as perhaps one of the most important things Lewis would ever do. 6. Prayer life is matured by suffering. Perhaps in the meantime, Lewis began to think of what was involved symbolically in the change of locale from Magdalen College, Oxford, to Magdalen College, Cambridge. "My address will be Magdalen, so I remain under the same patroness," he wrote to Sister Penelope on July the 30th, 1954. This is nice because it saves admin readjustments in heaven. At the end of the year, he wrote to his friend Vito Gebbert, "I think I shall like Magdalen, Cambridge, better than Magdalen, Oxford. It is a tiny college, a perfect cameo architecturally, and they're so old-fashioned, pious, and gentle and conservative, unlike this leftist, atheist, cynical, hard-boiled, huge Magdalen that had caused Lewis so much hurt." In a letter to Bede Griffiths on November the 1st, he asked, "Has any theologian, perhaps dozens, allegorized St. Mary Magdalene's act in the following way, which came to me like a flash of lightning the other day? The precious alabaster box which we have to break over the holy feet is her heart. It seems so obvious, once one has thought of it." So Lewis had come to see that prayer grows in the breaking of the human heart before God. His, perhaps, was broken since Oxford never recognized his worth to offer him a university professorship. And later still, it was broken again by the far more poignant grief of losing his wife in bereavement. Like all of us do, Lewis continued to struggle with God when he wrote in one of his poems, "By now I should be entering on the supreme stage of the whole walk, reserved for the late afternoon. The heat was over now, the anxious mountains, the airless valleys, and the sun-baked rocks behind me." Yet on June the 18th, 1962, he writes, "The plumbing often goes wrong. I need to be near a lifeline." Worse was to come. After the loss of his wife, he asks the raw and naked question, in A Grief Observed, "Where is God?" This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you are tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption, if you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is in vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and the sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence, you may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it even inhabited? It seemed so once, and that seeming was as strong as this. What can this mean? Why is he so present a commander in our time of prosperity, and so very absent a help in time of trouble? In times of such bitter sorrow, Lewis admitted that I'm not much in danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about him. In another of his poems, Lewis says, "Of this we're certain. No one who dared knock at heaven's door for earthly comfort found even a door, only smooth, endless rock, and save the echo of his voice, no sound. It's dangerous to listen. You'll begin to fancy that those echoes, hope can play pitiful tricks, are answers from within. Far better to turn, grimly sane, away. Heaven cannot thus, earth cannot ever, give the thing we want. We ask what isn't there, and by our asking water and live that very part of love which must despair, and die, and go down cold into the earth, before there's talk of springtide and rebirth." Yes, this is perhaps one of the deepest experiences of prayer, to be able to say to our Heavenly Father, "Lord, not my will, but thine be done." Lewis's theology of prayer. If Lewis's personal experience of prayer has these 6 traits, an earthly realism, a practical import, a natural and simple attitude, a strong supplicatory concern for others, warm and honest expressions of friendships, and matured by suffering, how do these characteristics shape his theology of prayer? Perhaps 2 features he stressed most in his writings were the problem of causality in prayer and the nature of petitionary prayer. But like other human beings, he had first to overcome morbid experiences of childhood before he could enter into a more truthful realism about the nature and exercise of prayer. So this we must consider as a necessary prelude. A child tends to relate to God as he relates with his parents. This correlation, unless corrected and healed, may persist, unconsciously so, throughout life. My real life, or what memory reports as my real life, was increasingly one of solitude, Lewis reports. He had bad dreams, like a window opening on what was hardly less than hell, he said. As a child of 7, he admits, solitude was nearly always at my command, somewhere in the garden or somewhere in the house. What drove me to write was the extreme manual clumsiness from which I suffered, so that he hated sports. His early years he described as living almost entirely in my imagination, or at least the imagination of those years now seems to me more important than anything else. Then, at the age of 10, his mother died. He remembered what he had been taught, that prayer offered in faith would be answered. Then, when she died, he shifted his ground to believe he now needed to believe in a miracle, seeing God merely as a magician. It left him with theological confusion about God for years to come. All happiness left him, and like the solid continent of Atlantis that disappeared under the waves, all that was tranquil and reliable disappeared from my life. It was all sea and islands now. At boarding school later, Lewis says he began seriously to pray and read my Bible and to attempt to obey my conscience. But his slight alienation from his distant father increased, and there was emotionally no solid ground for the child. Sometimes he would awake at night afraid that his only brother had slipped off with his father to America and left him behind. His prayers became sheer acts of despair. Having said them at night, his conscience would whisper that he had not said them properly enough. So he would try and try again until he fell asleep in frustration and lack of abiding assurance. A deepening pessimism eventually led him at university to decide he was an atheist, which for many has been the cold comfort of forgetting God in a conversion of relief. Perhaps the dread of frustrated prayers at night time never fully left him, and the issues of a reasoning faith about prayer were coloured perhaps as much from his early alienation as from his heightened intellectual search for the appropriate inquiry that would serve the logic of the mind more than the rest of the heart. Perhaps Lewis's cure was to rest in the presence of God, rather than be always inquiring about its appropriateness. 1. Lewis's emphasis upon festoonings in prayer. The bad situations of imagination and conscience that Lewis had placed himself in as a child explain, perhaps, the emphasis he placed later in life upon the importance of placing oneself in what he called prayerful situations or festoonings. Perhaps he learnt this from his own failures as a child to ever pray properly at all. Francis de Sales might also have helped him when he advises that, in meditation, place yourself in the presence of God. In honest humility, Lewis also learnt to see that at prayer one is in a more real situation than ever one could be in the real world. Prayer is the struggle to come to grips with rock-bottom realities, he said. Prayer, then, is the struggle for the real I to meet with the reality of God. Prayer, then, is saying, may it be the real I who speaks. May it be the real thou that I speak to. This is the prayer that precedes all prayers. Then, as the great iconoclast, God in his mercy may shatter all our false ideas and conceptions of him that so hinder our real prayer in life. Another area where festoonings of prayer are needed is in the realm of causality. Several times in his writings, Lewis recites the Pensée of Pascal. God instituted prayer in order to lend his creatures the dignity of causality. Lewis's comment is that God perhaps invented both prayer and physical action for that purpose. For God has granted us the dignity of both work and prayer together. So a proper attitude to both is to pray as we work responsibly with the gifts that God has given to us, as well as to go on praying when we can work no more. Indeed, prayer is a stronger force than causality, not a weaker form. For if it works at all, it does so unlimited by space and time. Prayer, then, is not a direct action over nature, it is action in cooperation with God, so we are most in harmony with God's provident action when we are in prayer before him. Perhaps the post-Einsteinian worldview ahead of us, still little appreciated in Lewis's day, now frees us from being so hung up with causality, as some of his contemporaries were, but neither is God. Our relationship with God, in faith that pleases him, is therefore still the vital prayerful situation for all praying. 2. Lewis and petitionary prayer. Wisely, then, Lewis argues that it is a wrong kind of question to ask, does prayer work? It misleads us about the true nature of prayer. The quiet composure of heart before God rests in a relationship that is deeper, far deeper than words can ever express. This is where Lewis so clearly rested, and explains why so little need be said, really, about prayer. It is to be experienced rather than superficially talked about. At the same time, Lewis honestly had difficulty with the apparent inconsistent character of petitions he noted in the Gospels, for he observed two different types of prayer which appear inconsistent with each other. Type A is the prayer taught by our Lord, "Thy will be done." In the light of the great submission of his passion, nothing can be asked for conditionally, only submissively so. It is asked in the Garden of Gethsemane without any reservation whatever. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Type B is the petition in faith, able to move mountains, to heal people, to remove blindness, and do much else. The Apostle seems to advocate it when he urges us to ask in faith, nothing doubting. James chapter 1, verses 6 to 8. Lewis asked many wise people about this apparent inconsistency and received no clear answer or solution. Hesitantly, Lewis suggested himself that until God has given us the faith to move mountains, it is perhaps better to leave them alone, for he created them, and that is his business. Instead, it is advisable to concentrate more attention on type A prayers that indicate that the surrender of self-will and self-love is more important than getting our own way, for we can easily misinterpret our perceptions of things in foolish, willful ways. Perhaps what Jesus actually did when he prayed submissively, as he did on the night of his betrayal, was actually to identify himself with our weakness, so that even the certitude of the Father's will was withdrawn from him, so that in his extreme humiliation, Jesus prayed as we tend to pray in our weakness. Our struggles may be, says Lewis, to even believe that God is a listener, not just that he is an enabler. Thus, Lewis remained modest, extremely so, about his prayer life. Perhaps nothing keeps us humbler than a healthy realism about the inadequacy of our personal relationship with God. Lewis knew times of dryness in his prayer life, what the medieval monks used to call accidiae. He warns us wisely against viewing our prayer life in relation to our emotions. Whenever they are attending to the enemy himself, wrote Screwtape to his assistant Wormwood, we are defeated. The devil's advice to his evil apprentice is to distract their attention from God himself to their feelings about God. So, when they ask for charity, he wrote, let them also be deflected by having charitable feelings. When they pray for courage, let them feel brave. When they seek forgiveness, divert them with feelings about forgiveness. Teach them to eliminate the value of each prayer by the success in producing the desired feeling. At all costs, avoid the real nakedness of the soul before God in prayer. It is that, argued Screwtape, that is so deadly, of being in the living presence of God himself. These, then, are some of the things Lewis teaches us by his life and honest reflections. They are homespun, for the truth is always simple, if it is lived rather than being mere theory. As the primary language of the soul, prayer is like saying the alphabet. It may not appear very profound to describe, yet it is essential, the basis of all communication with God, that leads us forward into mysteries yet unknown and still to be experienced. In the mercy of God, he takes our childhood wounds and memories to show us how deeply we need to ask, Lord, teach us to pray. Then, in the lessons he gives us through the lives of others as well as our own, he unfolds the most wonderful journey for the soul we could ever conceive. Little did Lewis realize as a child where that journey would take him, nor can we, but prayer remains its pulse beat. We give the last word to Lewis about his own experiences of prayer. Prayer, he says, in the sense of asking for things, is a small part of it. Confession and penitence are its threshold, adoration its sanctuary, the presence and vision and enjoyment of God its bread and wine. In it, God shows himself to us. That he answers prayer is a corollary, not necessarily the most important one, from the revelation. What he does is learn from what he is.
This recording has been produced by Spiritual Threads in cooperation with the C.S. Lewis Institute.